Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you. Most people have heard of phytoestrogens, but did you know there are beneficial phytoandrogens that mimic and support testosterone and more? The top source of these is pine pollen. If you're looking for 100% natural hormonal support for men and women, you've got to try this. Right now, Lost Empire Herbs' best-selling pine pollen is available for 1 penny plus shipping and handling. Go to geniuspollen.com to find out more and grab yourself a bag today. No hidden charges, no trial offer, no shenanigans. Just a low-cost way to try Lost Empire Herbs' top product for next to nothing.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do. But only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field. Sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest is Robin Buell. She's a Georgia Research Alliance Eminent Scholar Chair in Crop Genomics, all this at the University of Georgia. So we're going to talk about biofuels created from crops and also plant genomics. So Robin, thank you for coming.
Great. I'm glad to be here with you today.
Yeah. Well, if you would tell me what got you interested in crops, studying the genomics and studying biofuel, what's a bit about your background?
So I've been working on plants ever since I was an undergraduate. I've been doing plant genomics since 1999 when I joined the Institute for Genomic Research. And I don't know if you and your audience is aware, but genomics is a very recent field of science. It's only been around since 1995. It was pioneered by Craig Venter. And it's the interface of biology, genetics, and computation. And without any of those, we couldn't have the era of genomics now, which is where you would generate the DNA sequence of an organism. You'd make predictions about what genes are there and what do those genes do to give that organism, the ability to reproduce and grow and deal with stress. And so I've been doing plant genomics now since 1999. I work on a lot of different crops, but with various energy crises and the sustainability aspect of the planet right now, I became interested in how we could use plants for fuels directly. And using genomics, you can make a lot of basic advancements in our knowledge about specific plants and how plants take that carbon dioxide and make what we would call fixed carbon, right, wood or leaves. And then we know the biochemistry, and then can we modify that so that the plants will actually start to produce fuels that we could use for, either powering cars or to replace other petroleum-based products. And so that's how I became interested in it. That is understanding the genome, which is, your DNA sequence, your blueprint, so that you can then modify it so that plants do something other than, food or feed or ecological application.
I think I understand that certain plants you can, grind them up and make them into fuel, but you mentioned the plant making fuel itself. So what's the difference there? What does that mean?
So definitely, yeah. So we've heard about, maybe taking soybeans and crushing them, getting the oil and use that as biodiesel. But, now that we can understand a plant genome and we can do gene editing and we can do biotechnology, we can actually make the plants, instead of making, say, lots of wood or lots of leaves, we can actually introduce the genes to make very specific molecules such as precursors for fuels and have the plant produce it and then just extract it back from them. So this would be like a new era, sort of like, you know, how insulin, right? Now initially insulin came from cadavers, then it came from pigs, and now it's made by this bacterium called Escherichia coli in the lab, and it's produced essentially in a little bioreactor inside a laboratory, and you can get very pure insulin from there. And essentially what we'd like to do is take plants and make them be little bioreactors making specific fuels or fuel precursors or plastic precursors, so that we're not going to be dependent on petroleum products.
So what would that look like? What kind of plant would be amenable to this? What precursors, and then, you know, how would you harvest them from the plant?
So this is what's really sort of exciting. So I think what we learned around 2009, 2010, when everyone was trying to grow corn and then take corn and produce ethanol from it, which caused a lot of perturbations in the food market, in the grain market for corn. Like, we really don't want to upset that market. We don't want people taking prime agricultural production lands and making biofuels. What we'd like to do is find different plants that are suited to areas of the country or world that maybe isn't being used for agricultural production, but is well adapted to different kinds of plants, and have that produce the biofuel. So potentially you could use trees, and these could be trees that may grow fast, like poplar. You could use switchgrass, which is a perennial prairie grass, but it doesn't require much input to grow. You could think of other things that are more adapted to very dry climates as well, and have them produce it. So I think we don't want to think of like a one solution for all of this. We want to think of, let's find a plant that would grow well in a specific geographic region with different amounts of moisture and nutrients and light, and see what we can get it to produce without having to have a lot of inputs. And so I think now we have the technology and the knowledge to start to modify a lot of different kinds of plants for very specific regions.
What do you mean? So you'd modify a plant to make some precursor substance, but so then you end up taking the plant body and grinding it up, and because that substance is now in the plant and some concentration, now it's usable as a fuel, or literally how would it work?
Yeah, it could be as simple as that, just like thinking about taking soybean seed and crushing it and getting biodiesel out of that. Or you could have the plant make a precursor that's very stable, and then you would crush the leaves, you could grind the wood, you could have it produce seeds, and then you would make this precursor that you would then have take to a factory, and then the factory would do one of the last conversion events to make it into either biofuel or even what we would call a bioproduct, say a bioplastic, or other kinds of molecules that are used in large quantities that are currently being sourced from petroleum products.
Any candidates in mind, or how far is this just in the idea stage? Or
I think it's at the idea stage and the proof of concept in a laboratory setting. And I think we have to do that first to show that, first of all, that we can engineer these plants to produce compounds of interest, and that we can do it without major consequences on the plant growth. Because if we think about it, we're going to ask a plant that normally would just take carbon dioxide and water and a few nutrients, and it would just make leaves and wood, and it would make seeds, and it would reproduce and grow. And we're going to ask that plant, we're going to re-engineer that plant to produce these precursors for biofuels or bioplastics. And that's going to potentially come at a cost, right? That maybe the plant isn't as healthy, maybe the plant doesn't grow as fast. And so we have to do these proof of concept experiments in the laboratory so that we can then move to the field to test them in a field condition, because remember, the environment's going to have a major impact on plant growth and development. And then once we've shown that we can do it in a field setting, we can then move to these pilot scales where we can actually test it in the field.
Most supplements are taken on faith and could take weeks or months to have an effect. Even supplements backed by scientific studies may or may not deliver those same benefits to you. But what if you could feel the results of what you took within just a few days? Lost Empire Herbs offers the highest quality, wild-harvested, non-irradiated pine pollen, and that can dramatically impact your hormones fast. Right now, you can grab it for 1 cent plus shipping and handling at geniuspollen.com.
Okay, so that idea is, early on. What else are you working on that's further along in your research that would be interesting to talk about in
Yeah.
terms of genomics, let's say?
Yeah, so I can talk about one project that we have right now that we're about 1 year into it. And so this involves taking tomatoes. So we all know tomatoes grow quickly and they grow, you can grow them in a greenhouse, you can grow them in the field, and the tomatoes produce a lot of fruit. And in those fruits, it's compounds called terpenes. And terpenes have a lot, there's 50,000 kinds of terpenes. There's a lot of uses for different terpenes. Some are used as antimicrobials, some are used as insecticides, some are nutrition compounds. There's a lot of different types of terpenes. If you know, like citronella, that active compound is a terpene. You can think about, yeah. So plants produce a lot of terpenes, and they have a lot of different uses. Some are used in agriculture, some are used in pharmaceuticals, some are nutrition, like those red pigments you see in tomato fruit, that's a terpene. So these have a lot of different really important uses, and humans obviously have been using plants for their natural terpene production for thousands of years. So what we'd like to do is some of these terpenes come from plants or even, say, from microbes, and they're very hard to source in a sustainable manner. And so what we'd like to do is re-engineer tomato to produce these high-value terpenes in tomato fruit. And so what we're doing right now is we're getting a catalog of the genes in the tomato fruit responsible for terpene production. And then we're actually going to remove all of those genes so that the fruit doesn't produce terpenes. And then we're going to stick in biosynthetic genes from other organisms to produce some high-value terpene so that we can demonstrate that, yes, we could have a tomato plant that produces something in a sustainable manner in a 90-day period in a greenhouse, in the field, and you can extract it from tomato fruit, and instead of having to, say, grow a plant for 30 years or harvest it from a marine system, you can actually go grow this tomato plant, you can extract it from the fruit, and we already have the processing facility set up, right? We all know that we have canned tomatoes, we have tomato juice, there's all kinds of processing facilities available, so we could just put that into the existing infrastructure so that tomatoes can now be used in a sustainable manner to produce these high-value terpenes.
What are some other uses for terpenes, and which ones would you want to have produced in large amounts?
So I always like to just use an example, one example, just to get people sort of familiar with, like, plants produce a lot of natural compounds. So if you wanted to use an insecticide to kill different insects, you can actually go right now to Lowe's or Home Depot, any sort of store, and you could buy this insecticide called pyrethrins, pyrethrin based. And actually, that actually came from chrysanthemums to start with, but now it's actually made synthetically. So that's just an example, I think, of something where a plant produces something naturally, and we now make it through petroleum products. But if we could make it through a plant, that would actually be more sustainable. So we're actually, for what we're doing in this project, we're going to focus on a compound that actually has antimicrobial activity. And we'd like to make sure that we can produce it, that it's not modified, and it's produced at high enough levels so that that production in tomato fruit would be a viable production method. Another example would be sweeteners. You can make certain sweeteners as well. Those are terpenes. And we'd like to be able to make sweeteners in tomato fruit. Right now, stevia is a sweetener, and then there's other sweeteners that are actually terpenes, and we'd like to be able to produce them.
Well, I'm guessing it would be easier for a plant that already produces terpenes to just amp it up versus encourage a plant that doesn't produce a certain terpene to start making it, right?
Well, that's a good question, right? Like, why don't you just make the natural plant produce more of it? So first of all, that means we would have to be able to engineer that plant to make it, and we can't do that. We don't have the technology right now to do that in every different plant species. So I like to use this example of santalol, which comes from sandalwood trees, which are semi-tropical, and you have to grow that tree for several years in order to extract it from it. So there's certainly cases of terpenes of interest that you're not going to be able to do that. The other problem is that there's other terpenes that are present as well. So then you have to purify your terpene from the other terpenes that are. And so you'd like to sort of have sort of an empty reactor That's what our goal is with the tomato fruit, is that we've stripped out the ability of the tomato to produce terpenes in the fruit and just produce our terpene, right?
Well, okay, why do you have to strip out other ones? Can't you just heighten the one of interest and the other ones right along? Or, like,
Well,
I don't know, have you tried this? And what happens to the terpene mix? Let's say if you try to encourage a plant to produce more of one than another, what does it do? Or what could it do?
well, so I think one of the challenges is that in a lot of plants we don't know all the genes responsible for all the other terpene production, and if you sort of think of it as there's lots of potential reactions a plant could do, right? It could be producing tens or hundreds of different kinds of terpenes, and so if you make more of one terpene, it may not make enough of another one that's actually essential, and also if you change production of one, you could inadvertently change production of the other. So there's a lot of different steps, and all of a sudden you could be making one enzyme that might work on other terpenes as well. So you sort of want a clean slate when you do this expression. We would call this making a chassis, right? We're going to make a chassis so that we have a tomato fruit that doesn't produce terpenes, but if we give it the genes to produce a specific terpene, it'll make it and it'll be clean. And so we sort of have to remove all of those potential confounding genes that are present. And so there are examples where you put in a new gene or you increase expression of a gene and you get other novel things happening. And in order for this to become, used, you have to be able to show that it's not just customized for one specific terpene, that it could be used for a lot of different terpenes. So I think that's what's important, is it's sort of like going back to that insulin example, right? We produce a lot of pharmaceuticals and proteins in Escherichia coli in the lab because we've made that a nice chassis to just produce compounds of interest. So we understand everything about the genome and we've highly controlled it so that it's going to produce our compound and nothing else.
So what would be an ideal chassis? A plant that makes a whole bunch of different terpenes, or one that makes a predominant one that you're interested in? What do you think?
So I think the ideal plant would be one where you could engineer to produce a specific terpene in the fruit, a specific terpene in the leaves, and you could then essentially have dual purposes or multi-purposes for that plant. So I think that's what's sort of powerful, is that if you think about it in a plant, you would have a whole set of organs, right? You'd have your fruit, you would have your leaves, you could have your stems, or wood if it was a tree, and you could produce different compounds in different tissues and organs and features so that you could actually have a multi-purpose engineered crop. A pickup truck right now, right? It's a passenger vehicle. You could put 5 people in the cab, right? If it was a 4-door, and you can also haul stuff in the bed, and then you could hitch up a trailer and you could bring something else along. So if you're going to engineer something, the idea would be, the ultimate idea would be to have a multi-purpose plant and to make sure that it was as efficient as possible, right? That you weren't wasting any.
So multi-purpose is better than single function, making the plant produce terpene X until it explodes, essentially.
Yeah. And, right now, we're at the early stages, so we're focusing on just producing one terpene in the fruit in a clean manner without any interference from the native ability of the tomato fruit to make terpene.
So I guess it's probably a seesaw. If you push it too far, then the plant may suffer to the point where it can't be grown
That's exactly
fast enough,
right.
or it's not healthy.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the reason we've thought a lot about tomato fruit, right, is because it's already producing a lot of its own natural terpenes, those carotenoids, those pigments that you see in the fruit when it ripens. So it's already geared up to make the precursors for the terpenes, and we just want to remove those from the fruit and stick our genes in there to make our terpene. Now, the plant needs other terpenes in the leaves and in the stems and then actually in the seeds, but just in the pulp of the fruit, we wanted to make our terpene. And we don't want any interference by the natural terpene biosynthetic machinery in the fruit.
What about identifying plants that seem to produce a very high, concentration of a certain chemical? Like, I don't know, peppers came to mind. I don't know I'm serious. I don't know if ghost peppers, I guess they produce capsaicin. Maybe they produce a tremendous amount, but they can handle the load. So maybe a plant that has a chassis like that can produce, very high amounts of certain compounds and tolerate them might reveal something to you on how to get more efficiency out of this.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the one key thing that's sort of important for your listeners to know is that, to do all of this work, it's biotechnology. And that means we need to be able to manipulate the genes, and we need to be able to do it rather straightforwardly. And unfortunately, for a lot of plants, we can't do. So we may know what the genome looks like. We may have predictions about what the genes do, but we can't functionally test those in the lab. But we can for tomato, and that's why we're working.
Are there other ways in which plants could produce the terpenes you want? Like, I don't know, let's say there's a predator that approaches a certain plant, and in response as a defense, it produces terpenes. You probably would have to stimulate the plant to death where it would be shell-shocked, but maybe it's another mechanism.
No, so that's a really interesting question, right? So actually, if you step back for a second, most plants are very healthy outside, right? Like some plants, of course, obviously have some disease and have been eaten by insects, but overall, most plants are healthy and they're not being eaten alive. And that's because they have natural defense mechanisms, of which one component of that is terpene. But if you go and engineer a plant to have defenses always turned on, that actually has a penalty typically for plant growth and development. And that's what's known as the plant defense trade-off, right? If the plant has so much energy to expend, either growing or defending itself, there's a little trade-off. Too much defense, not as much growth, all growth, no defense. So there's a nice balance there. And that's a really big active area of research so that we can learn how to fine-tune that so that plants can have a defense without having an impact on yield.
What will be done with the plants? Again, let's say you're able to successfully have a tomato plant produce, a certain terpene in abundance. You're harvesting the plants, I guess, grinding them up, and then what do the remains go to? Can they be put back into the soil, or are they now something that needs to be segregated? What would happen, you think?
Yeah, so if we were able to do that, right, the rest of the plant, which would be the stems, right, and the leaves would just be, once this, you'd have to, it would be a regulated plant. You would have to make sure that you've disposed of the plant properly. But, if you've ever grown tomato fruit in a greenhouse, you know that you can continuously harvest that fruit over and over and over again. So you can get your first ripe fruit in less than 90 days, but you can continually harvest that fruit off of that plant continuously.
Okay. What about the bacteria? Like if you're using soil or even, hydroponics probably know, but with soil, the bacteria and the mycorrhizae that associate with the plant's root system, is there anything that can be done there to help the plant produce what you want, or could there be a different mechanism to produce what you want by having, let's say, a different microbiome associated with a certain plant to change its function?
There's a lot of microbiomes of plants, including symbioses with mycorrhizae. It's an active area of research, and there's definitely people working on beneficial communities of bacteria and fungi that can facilitate better growth and development. I'm not aware of anywhere they're doing that to make the plant produce something different. But definitely there's a positive impact of some microbiomes, just like there is in the human research field, in terms of enhancing health.
Yeah, there's too much to know. So I was just wondering. But I mean, if you're dealing with the genomics, there's like 10 other things to look at too. It's very complicated.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting area of research, right? That, there's this whole community of organisms, and some have benefits and some don't.
Okay, very cool. Well, Robin, what's the best way for people to learn more about your work? Where can they go?
So they could just do an internet search and look for Buell Lab at UGA, and they could find my website, and they can read about the different projects that we have.
Okay, Buell is Buell, Buell Lab, is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
University of Georgia. Okay, excellent. Well, Robin, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Remember, before you go, to grab your 1 penny bag of pine pollen for all the amazing, all-natural hormonal support that men and women the world over are raving about. Try it out and see how it works for you. All you have to do is head to geniuspollen.com to grab your bag today. Within days, you may be able to notice greater energy, more focus, added recovery, and more. Again, please visit geniuspollen.com to learn more now. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.